Yeah, actually, before we jump into the system, just one quick slide, concept of operations on how we think of business continuity management in ServiceNow. And really the first step is understanding your risks. And so that can be through business impact assessments, this can be through risk assessments that we're performing, and really starting to understand, well, what could happen when a disruption occurs. And some of that is involved in understanding your critical assets, your critical processes. And this is where we start to get interplay with things like vulnerability response. So if we can identify those critical processes and their dependence on certain applications and assets within the organization, we can start to tie this information together to say, well, if there's a critical vulnerability on an asset that supports one of these processes that's instrumental to the organization's ability to deliver our products and services, well, let's make sure that we have a shorter time to patch and remediate on those assets to avoid any potential issues. We then start to think about, well, what if we do have a problem? We need to start to define these response plans. So business continuity plans and disaster recovery, making sure that we're able to maintain our business operations and to identify how we would restore operations. And then we need to look at how we build assurance around that. So that's where we start to get into techniques like tabletop exercises, failovers, operational exercises, and really making sure that if and even when we have a disruption as an organization, we know how to minimize the disruption and restore operations. And really that's the last point, is when there is an incident, when there is an event, let's make sure that we're able to recover. So we're going to deploy or activate those different business continuity and disaster recovery plans through different exercises and crisis events. And as an output of that, we're going to look at it holistically and say, well, did this go well? What could we do better? Did we have risks that we were unaware of? And then that's where we start to feed this back into the process. This is a continuing process over time. And with that, we're going to jump over into the system and show you a few elements. And the first is actually going to be around vendor risk management. So as many organizations experienced over the last couple of years, there's a lot of disruption in supply chain and from our service providers due to the global conditions. And so when we think of vendor risk management, we think of it in multiple lenses. One is, well, we're going to do business with this new vendor. Let's understand their financial viability. Let's understand their fourth parties. Let's understand who they are at a macro level. But then as we're running and managing this program, as we're identifying issues, we need to think about, well, if we have an event like the Log4j or the SolarWinds breach, for example, let's make sure that we're reaching out to those vendors. Let's send them an assessment and ask very kind of targeted questions. And so we can start to look at reports here and say, well, a number of vendors, populations, what are those risks as we understand them? But maybe these very high risks vendors are the ones that we're going to be in contact most frequently because they pose the most potential risk to the organization. We want to make sure that we're managing that as best as we can. And so if we're looking at a potential Log4j scenario, we can actually come up with a impact assessment that we want to send to the vendor. And this is an example of a very light touch assessment to just help us start to understand if they were subject to that vulnerability. Did they perform an assessment? Has patching occurred on those identified assets? Do they know if their third parties were impacted, which would be our fourth parties? And really starting to leverage this information to help give us a more resilient program. And so this is just an example. This is something that as a vendor risk management team, as a resiliency team, you would have the ability to come in and define these questionnaires, send them out to your vendors.
Jay, we have a question. Just a real quick point here. Oh, Emil, please jump in.
Yeah, we have a question from the audience here about, says, when you talk about vendor risk management or third-party risk, what about supply chain risk? Do we cover that as all? I mean, as well? Or is it limited to vendor risk?
Yeah.
Or can we? Yeah.
That's a great question. So if we look at this, fictional vendor called WorkFaster here. They're a supplier of technology and services to our organization. And when looking at the record, we have a lot of summary information, including what we perceive their risk to be based on the different products and services, our different assessments, different external monitoring that we may be performing. But we can also keep track of their downstream suppliers, our fourth party. So if there is a potential issue, something like SolarWinds, having that information up front helps lessen the time for us to respond and say, well, there may have been an issue given the relationship there. And so this is another way that we can start to look more at the supply chain and say, well, if we're in a manufacturing organization, for example, and their supplier of a component for a piece that we purchase from them for our ultimate end product, well, we need to know if there's a potential issue coming sooner rather than later so that we can look at alternative suppliers, we can look at relocating some of those so that we don't have a larger impact should an event occur.
Thanks.
Excellent. So that's kind of how we think of it from a vendor perspective. Oh, please.
Kind of two things I wanted to follow up on there that you made me think of. So, one is I think what we're showing here is ServiceNow's vendor risk management solution, which is great about assessing, your third or your end parties, if you will. But, the organization internally has supply chain risk. And I think that was also what Emma was maybe chatting about. You could also use the IRM then to go manage, not just your IT risks, but your broader enterprise risks, which, would include the supply chain as well.
That's a great point. Yeah, so there's a lot of opportunity to tie these things together. One of those opportunities is when we start to look at business continuity management. So, one of the key activities from a business continuity management perspective is performing business impact analyses. That's looking at the different business processes and elements of our organization and determining where is their interreliance on the different processes and facilities. And one of the things we can start to look at from a BCM perspective or from a dependency perspective is which vendors are we leveraging in support of different processes. So in this example, we have a customer support business process, and we're performing a dependency assessment, and we're looking at things like what workplaces, what vendors, what applications do you use? And the information we can gather is, well, we're using this WorkFaster vendor. They're providing critical application services and staff outsourcing, and we need them to be recovered within 1 hour, or we're going to have a cascading effect in this example. And so this is another opportunity to start to tie some of that data together where we can start to understand where, and in your example earlier, Brian, around traveling, we could see that the plane is delayed. Let's make sure we start things in motion to avoid sitting at the airport for an extra 4 hours.
Jay, we actually have another question here regarding the BIA. The question is, will the BIA only cover the process dimension, or will it be extended to like systems or other type of objects?
No, that's another great question. So in this example, we are looking at a business process impact assessment, but we can set these up to perform application impact assessments. We can do a facility impact assessment, and really any element of the organization can be assessed to understand, well, what are impacts that could be realized? We have legal impact or workforce impact, revenue, regulatory, reputation impacts. Based on your lens that you put on this can be set up to assess those impacts on anything in the organization. So, what if we lose a critical supply center, a distribution center, and we're a products company, and we're trying to ship out all of our purchases? Well, we can do those sort of impacts and say, well, we'll have a reputational impact if this particular facility goes offline because our orders are going to be delayed and customers aren't going to be happy. And so, yeah, absolutely, you can assess nearly anything in the organization.
Yeah, thanks.
Excellent. In addition to, as it relates to these dependency assessments, we were looking at vendors, but we can look at those applications, we can look at software, hardware, whatever makes sense for what we're assessing. And these sort of linkages can help us understand what we would call maybe our crown jewel assets within the organization. And that's where we start to think about it from a vulnerability management perspective, saying we have critical processes and operations in the organization that are being supported by various assets, and we need to make sure that those are the most resilient. We need to make sure that, if there's a vulnerability, that they're patched as soon as possible, even faster than a typical patch cycle. If those assets go offline, we need to know, are we going to fail over to another data center? How are we going to make sure that these crown jewels are protected? And so this is an example from a vulnerability management perspective, of different vulnerable configuration items, ServiceNow's term for those different assets, and we can see how many of those are internet facing, how many of those are not, what the different classes are. So we've seen to have some web servers and network gear, application servers, and these are those vulnerabilities that are a critical risk to the organization and have the highest business value of these different assets. So these sort of reports and these different watches are really important to making sure that we're staying on top of every angle of the business to make sure that we're as resilient as possible.